coming. First, I want to give you a warning. This talk comes with spoilers for the 1975 movie Jaws, as well as some mild violence and gore, as one might expect when discussing giant man-eating sharks. I'm also going to assume that you have some familiarity with the plot of Jaws. If not, whoops. There we go. Okay, so I already covered this in the intro a little bit, but a little background about me and my past work. I've worked at Sony Research and Development during launch of the PS3. I helped 2K Games port BioShock to the PS3 and worked on BioShock 2. Also the DLC for that game, a game called The Bureau XCOM Declassified. And then I decided to quit AAA development and found the Fulbright Studio. We made Gone Home. I was the sole programmer on that game. And then I left that studio and founded Dim Bulb Games. In early 2018, we shipped Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. Thank you. So this is a talk about refining your game idea, or getting from a basic idea to a more workable place. I'm still going to stay mostly in the realm of ideas in this talk. Actual production or even prototyping is beyond the scope of what I'm discussing here. And of course, everybody will have a different approach to this sort of thing. This is mine. Probably most people honestly just wing this stage. So this is a little bit of an attempt at formalizing my process, at least. Let's start with the premise that you have an idea for a game. That's awesome. But anyone who's made games before will know that that's the easiest part, right? What I'm interested in the process of taking an idea about a game and figuring out the important parts of that idea. How do you begin to test whether this idea is practical and what scopes it might work at? A lot of people call the important parts of a design the pillars. You may have heard design pillars or similar terms before. However, personally, I prefer the term lodestars. They're the key parts of a design that point in the direction that you want to be traveling. The reason that I like that term is that if you give up on a pillar, it sounds like everything is going to collapse. But if you give up on a lodestar, you're just going in a slightly different direction than you were before. So to find the lodestars of our design, we're going to try to tease out what's important about our game idea. And importance varies based on who you're asking, right? What in this idea is important to you personally, right? Why do you feel this would be a good game? What about this calls out to you? And then you also have to ask, what in the idea is important to the design of the game? Which parts of the idea will your setting, tone, narrative, and mechanics be based on? And lastly, what about the idea will be most important to your audience? If you're making a game about robbing banks, but it turns out that you're excited about kind of the heist movie planning stage of things, but your audience has a bank robbing fantasy that involves like shootouts and getaway driving, that's important to know. Here's my process. So this obviously isn't terribly useful without an example, so I'm going to run through one. Here is our good friend Jaws. I assume everyone came to this talk because you like this movie. This is an example from a piece that's already made. Let's assume just for the moment that we're trying to make a game based on our love of Jaws. We don't want to license the IP as an indie. That's a bad idea. It'll cost you a lot of money up front, and it'll make your game a really risky proposition right out of the gate. But thinking about how you might make an existing IP into a game is a really great thought exercise. Plus, as we'll see here, if you're in love with an IP, you can make something similar of your own really easily, capturing whatever makes it important to you in your game. So breaking down our idea, I like to think of 3 different things when I do this exercise. I think about plot, tone, and themes. Other people will probably come up with other ways to examine an idea or a work, but those are what work well for me. So we're going to take those things as lenses and try to give ourselves some guiding stars for our unauthorized Jaws game. First, the plot. That's the easy part. A big shark terrorizes a resort community. You can go more specific when you're looking at plots. You could go anything from that vague sort of one-sentence TV guide description all the way to a complete copy of the script of Jaws. But I find it's easier the looser you stay. Perhaps it's important to you that in the movie Jaws, the community wins at the end, and then you might include that in your description. But for now, let's stick with a big shark terrorizes a resort community. And that's pretty cool, right? Sharks are neat. But we're going to avoid the shark. It would be really easy to just replace the shark with almost anything else and keep the rest of the movie intact. In fact, Peter Benchley, the guy who wrote the Jaws novel, he also wrote a book called Beast that is essentially exactly the same as Jaws, except it's about a giant squid. I kind of personally wish that that one had gotten the Spielberg treatment. I think that would be really cool. Lots of tentacles. But anyway, our plot lodestar is pretty easy to extract from here. Something terrorizes a community. Next up is the tone. We're moving in increasing complexity here, right? Plot can be described in a couple of sentences, but tone is a little more complex. Of course, Jaws is a tense thriller, but like most thrillers, it has a slow ramp up to the really exciting parts, building tensions as we go. There's also two main areas. We're either in the town or beach area, right, which is a well-lit, happy, and well-populated space that nevertheless gets invaded by terror, or we're on the boat, often at night, which is this cramped, vulnerable space that's in the territory of the enemy. So if we were going to take a lodestar from the tone of this movie, we'd probably want to keep a tense, pressure-driven thriller, but we may also want to maintain this idea of two tones or modes, depending whether you're at home or out at sea. It's a different feeling to have your safe space invaded than it is to go out in the darkness a-hunting. Next, we move on to the themes of Jaws, and this is always where I find the most meat when I'm looking for lodestars, but that probably varies from person to person. This is also the most complex of the three things that we're looking at. There's only one plot. As we've seen, there might be a few different tones, even in the same movie, but themes you can just go on for days, and don't worry, I won't. I've no doubt that any other reading of this movie would find other things than the ones I've chosen to highlight, but let's see what we find. First, Jaws is a classic narrative conflict of character versus nature. If this theme of the movie is what resonates with you, you have a lot of choices for making something similar. We run up against nature all the time. Animals, storms, the elements. Usually in those stories, nature is shown as this implacable force that can't be reasoned with, and it doesn't care about us. We even have a metaphor for things like that, a force of nature, right? In Jaws, the force of nature can be killed, but that's not always the case. Another example of a story using this device is Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, which has a lot of parallels to Jaws on the surface, although for the old man, the struggle doesn't end when the fish is dead. In any case, let's pull a guiding star from here, the immensity of natural forces and humanity's resilience in the face of them. But we're just getting started with themes. There's lots in here. If you remember from Jaws, there's initially a very simple solution to the problem. Close the beaches. It will save lives, and once the shark realizes it can't eat, it'll leave. The only problem is that the town will lose money if they admit there's a shark out there. The mayor is adamant that all the evidence be swept under the rug so that they won't scare away the tourists. So there's another theme of Jaws. Capitalism sucks, and greed kills. I seem to find that theme in a lot of media I consume these days. I don't know. So Jaws were made today. It would be easy to read it as a film about global warming, right? The people who make money want to bury the facts, while angry nature kills more and more. Unfortunately, it falls apart a little bit at the point where you can't just shoot the problem. But anyway, here's another lodestar for us. People's greed outweighing their better sense, putting others at risk for profit. Next, another common theme, monsters, or the fear of the unknown. The ocean is a terrifying place. We as a species barely know what's going on out there, and as individuals, it's far too vast and deadly for us to deal with. We don't know what's out there, and what's out there might not care about us, or worse, care deeply about us in all the wrong ways. It doesn't have to be the ocean, though. Jaws is danger seemingly out of nowhere, disrupting our placid safety, and it's inhuman and uncaring. It's a monster. So let's grab this as another lodestar. It's a vast unknown territory with unknown dangers, disruption of the normal, and a foe outside our experience. Okay, and then this is the last theme we're going to pull out of Jaws. I told you I find this stuff really rich ground, but this is a little bit more off the beaten track for games than the previous three, but I think that's a good thing. Jaws also looks at what I'm calling models of classic masculinity. As ideas of gender go, it's way outdated from a 2019 perspective, but it's still interesting to look at since it's an undeniable part of the original movie. In Jaws, you have three main characters, all men, because there are basically no women in Jaws. You have Quint, the hunter. He's a veteran. He's tough, grizzled, unafraid, and hyper-competent at killing fish and sailing boats, and he's intensely blue-collar. Then you have Hooper, the scientist. He's an intellectual. He's also hyper-competent, but in a different field. He knows everything there is to know about sharks. He's a smartass, but he's also tough and unafraid. And then you have Chief Brody. He's the police chief and a father and a family man. He is not tough. In fact, he's afraid of boats and afraid of the water. To me, it's really interesting that the cop figure here is the wimpy one, right? But we can see the three of them relating most clearly in this scene where they're comparing scars with each other. They're telling stories of shark attacks, war, and bravery. And the only scar that Brody has is the surgery scar from having his appendix out. In the end, the grizzled killer is the guy who dies, and the nerdy father is the one who saves the day. It's kind of interesting. So let's pull that out as our last guiding star. What does it mean to be a man? The roles that the movies looks at are definitely outdated today, but the question is probably even more relevant. It might even make an interesting piece of a game. Okay, so we could keep going with themes all day, probably, but here's what I ended up with as the guiding stars for a Jaws game. Something is attacking a community. It's a tense thriller with a shift between home and away areas. It's dealing with the immensity of natural forces and humanity's resilience in the face of them, with people's greed outweighing their better sense, putting others at risk for profit, in a vast, unknown territory with unknown dangers, with disruption of the normal, and a foe outside our experience, and asking, what does it mean to be a man? Now that we have those lodestars, I want to point out something important about Alien. Real quick, I'm going to run down some possible thematic, tonal, and plot lodestars that we might pull out of the 1979 movie Alien. Right. So, aside from the last one here, you'll notice that these two movies share a lot of thematic and tonal overlap. At least the way we've chosen to look at them, right? And that's great, because it shows that we can get to a lot of different places using the same guiding principles. If we just change our aesthetics and settings slightly, we might make a Jaws game that stars Sigourney Weaver. That's wonderful. It's really great that two teams using the same basic thoughts would get to two radically different places in their approach, because that's your chance to make the game personal and put your fingerprints all over it. The little decisions you make will radically change the end product. It's quite possible, of course, that something about the aesthetics or setting of Jaws is important to you, and that's a good thing to know when you're assembling your lodestars. I don't focus on that, because I think it's really valuable to keep things like aesthetics undetermined until later. As we'll see, they can fall out of the lodestars when you start asking questions about them. But this is a good place to maybe check in with your questions about what's important. Do these lodestars that you've come up with capture what's important to you, to the game design, and to the audience about the original idea? If not, then you might start looking for what's missing at this stage. I don't actually need this slide to make my point, I just thought it was funny. Okay, but not very many of us are trying to make games based on movies from the 1970s, I hope. I'd like to quickly run through the same process with an original idea. This will be a little harder in some ways because we have more freedom and ideas tend to change when we start examining them closely, but we can end up in the same place. And the shape of your idea will change depending on where you naturally start with this process. Some people gravitate towards plot or tone or themes or maybe a mix of all of them. You could also start, though, from a more practical perspective, like horror games seem to sell well right now, right? Or something like that. If your idea does start from a single point of plot, tone, or theme, you should probably at least figure out the sort of things that might mesh well in other areas. For instance, a shark game could be funny, but if you're trying to build a game around that theme about monsters and fear of the unknown, then a funny tone probably won't work well for that. But speaking of funny games, let's make a game about farming in pre-revolutionary Russia. So that's the plot. The tone, it could be funny if you wanted to do a dark humor satire kind of thing, like Dead Souls or something like that, but I'm actually going to make this a bleak game because the themes that I came up with thinking about this are things like the difficulty of survival in the serf system, the crushing weight of authority, and the fundamental inequality of an aristocracy. And this obviously is just me making stuff up right now, right? And that makes this process a little easier than Jaws because you don't have to do a deep reading of this idea, but it also makes it a little harder because there aren't those rails that kind of guide you towards these answers. Oh, excuse me. So now we start asking questions about these things that we've come up with, using our lodestars as guiding points. And there's no right answer to these questions. These are the little choices that will make your game wildly different from anyone else's. So these are questions like, how much control do you have as a designer? Is this game more systemic with emergent player behavior, or is it more narrative with a linear story? Systems can be really powerful, right? Since the Russian farming game is about systemic oppression, it might make sense to build that out of systems and use that in your gameplay. But for Jaws, because it's a tense thriller and we want to control that pacing, perhaps a more linear narrative is the way to approach that. So what verbs does the player have access to? In Jaws, the movie, the protagonists don't really do a lot of video game things, right? So coming up with verbs for that will be a really interesting challenge. But we can always ask what sort of actions would reinforce the themes and tone that we're going for. What perspective is the game in? First person might feel more intimate and terrifying than third person if we're making our Jaws game, right? A god's eye view, like in an RTS, is probably not the right choice, since that implies a measure of knowledge, control, and separation that undermines that tone. But it would probably work for a Russian farming game. What is the art style like? So this is where I would choose to do the aesthetic exploration sort of stuff, right? So Jaws differs hugely from Alien in this respect, as well as some others, but the bright beach scenes and vacation coloring in Jaws emphasize that domestic safety of half of the tone of the movie, right? And for the farming game, though, we'd want something dreary and drab, because bleak is the watchword for our tone there. For that, I might personally look at period art for inspiration. Are there multiple points of view or just one main character? I bring this one up, I wouldn't ask this necessarily for any game, but because Jaws might call for it. We're investigating different ways of being a man, and the way that the movie chooses to do that is by having 3 different characters. But our Russian farming game, you might have different characters, but you probably only have a single point of view for that. So I'm not going to answer all of these questions, but I think you can start to see the sort of things that I would ask if I were going through this process. This process is basically never-ending, though, and it just gets more granular. You'll probably be deep in production of your game, asking yourself, what can Jaws teach me about my graphics menu? Oops. Wait, are we... Technology. There we go. Okay, so, sorry. Some other points here. It is possible to start with the same idea and get different guiding stars out of it, right? Someone else would break down Jaws totally differently than I did here. It's also possible to start with the same guiding stars and get different answers to your questions. Perhaps you decide that one of those stars is more important than another one, and that steers us in a totally different direction, right? You can reevaluate your stars at any time. A really great time to do that is when you're scoping your game. For instance, if you decided that your Jaws game required 3 different characters with different stories in an entirely realistic 3D world, your producer or whoever is doing your budget and schedule might have something to say about that decision. You can give up on stars, right? Again, it just changes the direction that you're moving in, and that's totally fine. Games are a process of constant iteration, and you don't need to stick with what you initially decided. Likewise, of course, you can add stars if you feel like you missed something important when you were going through the process initially. Here are some stars that I was using for Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. I came up with these at the very start of development. If you're familiar with the game at all, if you've played it, you're wandering and collecting stories and telling them. But the last bullet point there, the real-time story remixing, that's not in the game. I had to give up on that one because I experimented a bunch with ways of doing that, and none of them really worked out without clashing in some way with the other stars. So I just dropped it. And I did add other stars to this too as development progressed. And this was really helpful because there were times during development when I lost sight of what I was trying to make, and when I had design issues, I would go back to this list, and that would help. For instance, there's a feature in the game where you collect stories and you tell them to people, and those stories grow in the telling, and they become more interesting, better stories. And that wasn't originally in the game. That wasn't in the design. But it was added later in development when I realized that I was kind of missing this feeling of the ever-changing nature of folk cultural remixes, right? One of these stars up here. So, to sum up, you start by deconstructing your idea in various ways to extract these load stars. You ask questions of those stars and see where they guide you. And you continually reevaluate and revisit to make sure you're on track. And again, this is just my approach. I hope it does some good for you, though. Thank you. Q&A now?
Yes.
Okay.
So if anyone does have any questions, we've got 2 mics lined up on either side of the aisle. We've already got, no, you can go, you got this. All right, we're gonna take our first question.
Yep.
Hi.
Oh, hi.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation, it was awesome. I do have a question about, at the very beginning you talked about the load stars being important to your audience. How do you evaluate that without actually building the game?
That is a really good question, and I'm not sure that you can 100% ever, right? Like, as we all know, putting a game out is a terrifying experience, and it may or may not resonate. But I think that's something where playtesting comes in, especially early on. This is where the prototyping process becomes really important, where getting feedback from friends or people close to you becomes really important. You can say, I'm trying to make a game about bank robbery. Here it is. And you give them, you know, even just the roughest thing you've got. People will play it and they'll be like, well, you know, I really wanted to be the one like running in a Nixon mask with a gun or whatever sort of thing. And you have me sitting down at a table and making charts. That's not what I see as a bank robbery or whatever, right? So you're never going to know for sure, but you can hopefully test that process with some potential audience members, let's say.
Do you have any more questions?
This working? Yeah, okay, cool. Hey, thanks for the talk. Question, how do you avoid, like you're doing your process, you find your load stars, and you're going well. How do you avoid being stuck in a local maxima of like not exploring? Do you stop exploring at some point, or do you find a higher maxima, say?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Games are a process of iterating always, right? Making games, and you can definitely get into a point where you've gone down a dead end and you need to go back and reevaluate what you've come up with to get yourself out of that. I think you're always going to end up, honestly, at a local maxima. Like, there's no reason that a heist bank robbery game is any worse than a shooty bank robbery game, right? It's just what you're trying to make. And one of those, you know, they're potentially equally good. It just is based on what you are trying to make. Hopefully you have done your reevaluation constantly enough that you don't get yourself into a position where you've got like 70% of the game done and you're wildly reevaluating things, because that would suck.
We have time for one more question.
Hey, do you have any examples of when following one of these load stars really like screwed you over or messed up production?
Oh, gosh, that's a good question. I'm sure I probably do. I think that Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, one of the things that I originally was thinking about was making it an incredibly bleak and depressing and sort of crushing game, something more like Cart Life, where you just could not get ahead and it was a horrible experience to play it, and that was not a good idea. Luckily I didn't go too far down that path, but I definitely did have to rejigger systems partway through the game, because I was like, you know what, this isn't what I want. Okay, thank you so much.